Mrs. Daniels glanced over the rows of students sitting in her classroom. It was the beginning of another semester at Jefferson High School, and as always, she felt a bit of hesitation. The students were mostly the same, bright-eyed teenagers trying to find their way through the maze of their teenage years. But today, there was something different. Today, a new student walked in, Marcus Johnson. She'd heard about him. His reputation preceded him in the hallways, another kid from the tougher part of town, another student struggling to make it through school. She had seen enough students like him in her 20 years of teaching to know what to expect. They often arrived at her classroom with a sense of resignation in their eyes, shoulders hunched, almost expecting to fail before they'd even started. And to be honest, Mrs. Daniels had a soft spot for those students. She understood their struggles. But sometimes, despite her best intentions, she couldn't help but wonder if they would make it. Marcus stood at the door, his posture straight but his eyes downcast. He had a slight frown on his face, the kind that told Mrs. Daniels he wasn't here by choice. She raised an eyebrow. She knew that kind of expression well, it was the face of someone who had been told they weren't good enough, not capable enough. She motioned to the desk next to the window. "You can sit there, Marcus," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. He nodded and walked over slowly, taking his seat without a word. The class settled into its usual rhythm, and Mrs. Daniels began her lesson. She was careful to make the material engaging, no one liked the dry, boring stuff, after all. But as the lesson went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was different from the others. He was too quiet. Too reserved. Like he was hiding something. Throughout the class, Mrs. Daniels kept glancing over at Marcus, trying to gauge his level of interest. His notebook was open, but he wasn't writing anything down. He just stared at the board, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Daniels assumed he was probably lost in his own thoughts, maybe even already checked out of the lesson. That wouldn't be unusual. She had seen students who had given up on school long before they walked into her classroom. After a while, she moved to a new part of the lesson, a complicated algebra problem on the board. She could feel the tension in the room rise, this was the part where most students struggled. She had seen it 1,000 times. Students would squirm in their seats, scribble down whatever they could, and hope for a miracle. But not Marcus. When she turned back to the class, his hand was raised. Mrs. Daniels hesitated for a moment. It wasn't unusual for students to ask questions, but something about the way he held his hand made her pause. She had expected him to be one of those who stayed silent, who didn't dare to speak up. But here he was, confident, his hand held high. "Yes, Marcus?" she asked, trying to mask her surprise. He didn't hesitate. "The equation you wrote on the board," he began, his voice calm and clear. "It can be simplified using this approach." He walked up to the board, much to Mrs. Daniels' astonishment, and with swift precision, began to work through the problem. His movements were so fluid, so natural, it was as if the math had already been etched into his mind. The students watched, their eyes wide. Mrs. Daniels' jaw dropped as Marcus effortlessly solved the problem, simplifying it in a way she hadn't even thought of. The complexity of the equation, normally a challenge for even her best students, was nothing more than a speed bump for him. When he finished, he turned around and looked at the class, his expression still neutral. He didn't seem proud or smug, he was simply stating a fact. "That's how you do it," he said, his voice quiet but confident. The room was silent for a long moment. Mrs. Daniels' mind raced. What just happened? Had she missed something? A wave of discomfort washed over her as she realized that she had been wrong about Marcus. The doubt she had about him, about his potential, his ability to succeed, was based on assumptions, not facts. She'd written him off without even knowing him. And now, here he was, shattering those assumptions in front of the entire class. The students began whispering among themselves. One by one, they turned their eyes toward Marcus, their skepticism replaced by awe. Mrs. Daniels cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the class. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, her voice a bit shakier than she had intended. "That was impressive." Marcus nodded and returned to his seat. But Mrs. Daniels couldn't stop staring at him. She had seen smart students before, but this was different. This wasn't just intelligence, it was genius. And it was buried beneath a facade of disinterest, an indifference that made it impossible to see just how gifted he really was. For the rest of the class, Mrs. Daniels couldn't focus. Her mind was occupied with thoughts of Marcus. Who was this kid? Why had no one told her about his incredible talent? More importantly, why had she assumed that he wouldn't be anything more than another statistic? After the bell rang and the students filed out of the room, Mrs. Daniels stood at her desk, deep in thought. She felt embarrassed, ashamed even, for having judged Marcus before even giving him a chance. But as much as she wanted to ignore it, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something extraordinary. She picked up the grading papers that were scattered across her desk, but her mind kept drifting back to Marcus. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. "Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from," she imagined saying, as if her thoughts were being broadcast for an audience. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? She glanced at the empty chair where Marcus had sat. His story was far from finished. And so was hers. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Marcus Johnson's life had always been marked by the kind of struggle that many would never truly understand unless they'd lived it themselves. He had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, where dreams were often dismissed as fantasies, and where survival was the first priority. His mother, Sharon Johnson, had done everything she could to provide for him, but the odds were always stacked against them. Sharon was a nurse who worked long, grueling hours at a nearby hospital. She loved her job, but the stress of it often left her exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Marcus, at just 16, had become something of a caretaker for his younger brother, Aaron, and the makeshift head of the household when his mother was away. He had learned early on that there were no guarantees in life, and no matter how hard you worked, sometimes it felt like the world was against you. Their apartment was small, located on the third floor of an aging building on the edge of the city. The neighbors were loud, and the hallway always smelled faintly of mildew, but Marcus didn't mind. It was home. And despite the chaos of their environment, he always found solace in his books. The library, in fact, was his sanctuary. While most of the kids his age were out in the streets, getting involved in things they would later regret, Marcus found peace in the pages of novels, textbooks, and science journals. His love for learning was what kept him going. But that love was often overlooked. At school, Marcus was just another kid from the wrong side of the tracks. Teachers rarely saw beyond his rough exterior. His clothes, worn and frayed, were a constant reminder of his family's financial struggles. And his quiet, almost detached demeanor made him an easy target for the judgment of his peers. They saw him as a troublemaker, a kid who was just there to waste time until he inevitably dropped out, like so many before him. For years, Marcus had dealt with the weight of being underestimated. His teachers often wrote him off as a student who lacked focus or ambition. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that he had a mind that soared far above the ordinary. His intelligence, his gift for understanding complex subjects, was something he kept hidden from everyone. The reason he kept it hidden wasn't out of laziness or fear of failure. No, it was because he had learned that showing too much of himself only led to disappointment. When he had been younger, he'd been excited to share his ideas, his discoveries. But those moments were met with skepticism. "You're just a kid," they would say. "You don't know what you're talking about." The dismissive remarks hurt more than he let on, and over time, he stopped sharing his brilliance. Instead, he faded into the background, content to do the work, but never calling attention to himself. Even his mother, though supportive, had a hard time understanding his true potential. Sharon loved Marcus with all her heart, but her focus was always on survival. She worked so hard just to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table that she rarely had the time or energy to notice how extraordinary her son truly was. She saw his grades, good, but not exceptional, and assumed that was the best he could do. But Marcus knew better. The truth was, he didn't care much for the grades. He didn't care for the system that ranked him and judged him based on arbitrary standards. What he cared about was understanding the world around him, the stars, the universe, how everything connected in ways most people would never grasp. That's where his real genius lay. He could look at the same problem everyone else struggled with and see a solution that no one else could even imagine. It wasn't about impressing others or proving something to them, it was about finding the answers to questions that kept him up at night. At the end of each school day, Marcus would retreat to his small room. The walls, plastered with pictures of the planets and equations he'd copied from old science magazines, gave him comfort. It was here, in the solitude of his own mind, that he felt most at peace. He would lose himself in the beauty of mathematics, physics, and the vastness of space, his thoughts drifting far beyond the confines of the city he called home. Yet, no matter how many books he read or how many hours he spent in his room contemplating the mysteries of the universe, he knew that he was trapped in a cycle. The world outside his room was cold and unforgiving, and the judgments he faced from others were impossible to escape. He couldn't hide forever. Eventually, the world would see him for what he truly was, or so he hoped. When Marcus entered high school, he carried the weight of those experiences with him. He entered Mrs. Daniels' class with a mix of hope and resignation, unsure if this year would be different, if anyone would see him for who he really was. He wasn't sure if he was ready to open up, to reveal the depth of his abilities, or if he even wanted to try anymore. But there was something different about Mrs. Daniels. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, for pushing her students to be their best without ever coddling them. She didn't judge based on where they came from, she judged based on what they could do. At least, that was what Marcus hoped. He never expected her to see him as anything other than just another kid who was trying to survive high school. But as he sat in her class that first day, his mind already racing ahead of the lessons, he felt a spark of something. Maybe, just maybe, this year could be different. But then again, he'd thought that before. And every time, the result had been the same. He wasn't sure what to expect anymore. But one thing was certain, he would prove them all wrong. He would show them that, despite everything, he was capable of so much more than they could imagine. As the days went on, Mrs. Daniels couldn't stop thinking about Marcus. She had seen him in action in class, and the level of brilliance he had displayed was beyond anything she had anticipated. His ability to grasp complex concepts and break them down with ease was like nothing she'd ever witnessed from a student his age. But there was one thing that gnawed at her, the same thing she saw in the eyes of many other students like Marcus, the quiet doubt. Marcus wasn't trying to stand out, wasn't seeking attention. He sat through every lesson with an expression that said he was already a step ahead, yet he kept to himself, avoiding the spotlight. Mrs. Daniels couldn't help but feel a sense of both admiration and concern. What was going on behind that quiet demeanor? She had seen students with extraordinary abilities before, but Marcus's indifference, his complete lack of desire to be seen, was a red flag. Over the next week, she made it a point to watch him more closely. His work was flawless, effortless even, but his behavior was puzzling. He rarely participated in class discussions unless called on, and when he did speak, it was brief, as if he were simply giving the minimum required to move things along. Mrs. Daniels, always one to challenge her students, tried to get him to open up, to engage more in the lessons. But every time she pushed, he withdrew further. It wasn't just his lack of participation that bothered her. There were times when he seemed almost disconnected from the rest of the class. During group activities, he would often sit back, not interacting with his classmates. His peers, noticing his aloofness, started whispering behind his back. They couldn't understand why he wasn't like them, why he didn't care to be a part of their social circles. Some of them began to resent him, though they couldn't quite put their finger on why. One afternoon, during a group project in class, Marcus was paired with Sarah, a lively and talkative student known for being the heart of the class. Sarah had an instinct for bringing people together, for making them feel included. But Marcus didn't make it easy. "Hey, Marcus, we're doing a project on human evolution. I thought we could divide the sections and work together," Sarah said, flashing him a smile. Marcus nodded curtly, not looking her in the eye. "Sure," he said, his voice flat. Sarah frowned, trying to make the best of the situation. She was used to working with people who had more energy, who were enthusiastic about collaborating. She tried to ask him about his ideas, but every time she did, he gave short, dismissive answers. It was as if he had already decided that this project wasn't worth his time, even though his knowledge of the subject clearly outstripped theirs. "Okay, so maybe we can brainstorm some ideas for the presentation. What do you think?" Sarah asked, attempting to make the conversation flow. "I already know what I'm going to do," Marcus said, barely looking up from his notebook. "Just tell me when it's time to present." Sarah's brow furrowed. She wasn't used to this kind of behavior. "Come on, Marcus, we have to work together on this," she insisted. "We need to make sure everything connects. The teacher will expect us to collaborate." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scribbled something on his notebook, his face impassive. Sarah could feel the tension rising, and it made her uncomfortable. She had no idea what was going on in his mind, but she could tell that Marcus wasn't like the others. Later that week, Mrs. Daniels noticed a growing divide between Marcus and the rest of the class. She overheard snippets of conversation as the students murmured about him. "Why is he always acting like he's too good for us? Yeah, it's like he doesn't even care about being here. He's smart, sure, but he's not part of the group. I don't get it." Mrs. Daniels felt a sense of unease. She had seen this before, the isolation of the student who stood out too much, the one who was so different that others didn't know how to relate to them. But in Marcus's case, it was deeper than just being socially awkward. There was something more to it, something that made him not just distant, but almost unreachable. The next day, Mrs. Daniels decided to confront him. It wasn't something she did often, but she felt a pull to understand him. She caught him alone after class, sitting at his desk, his eyes focused on a page in his notebook. "Marcus," she began, her voice gentle but firm. "Can we talk for a moment?" Marcus looked up at her, his expression guarded, almost defensive. "What's up?" "I've noticed that you're not really engaging with the rest of the class," she said, taking a seat next to him. "You're incredibly bright, Marcus. But you're holding back. I want to know what's going on. Why don't you want to be a part of the group?" For a moment, Marcus didn't say anything. He stared at her, his eyes filled with something. Was it frustration? Anger? Or was it something deeper, something he was afraid to confront? Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Because I don't belong here. I don't fit in. They don't get me. And honestly, Mrs. Daniels, I don't care if they do." Mrs. Daniels was taken aback by his words. She hadn't expected him to open up so quickly, but his words stung. She could tell that there was more to his story than just typical teenage angst. There was a pain there, something he had buried deep inside himself. "You're wrong, Marcus," she said softly. "You do belong here. You belong in this classroom, and you belong with us." He shook his head. "Not really. You just don't know what it's like." Mrs. Daniels paused, her mind racing. What was it like for him? What had he been through that made him feel this way? She had seen students with difficult backgrounds, but Marcus was different. He wasn't angry at the world, he was resigned to it. "I may not know exactly what it's like," she said, "but I'm here for you, Marcus. And I want you to succeed. But that's going to take some trust. You're going to have to open up. You can't do this on your own." For a long moment, Marcus didn't respond. He simply stared at the desk, his jaw clenched. Mrs. Daniels didn't press him further. She had planted a seed, and she hoped it would grow. But she also knew that Marcus wasn't ready to trust her, or anyone, just yet. As she walked away, she couldn't help but wonder what was really holding him back. And more importantly, if he would ever be able to break free from the doubts and walls he had built around himself. The following days in Mrs. Daniels' class were filled with a tense undercurrent, one that neither she nor Marcus could shake. The divide between him and the rest of the class only deepened as the weeks passed. Marcus still excelled in his work, effortlessly solving complex problems and even offering innovative solutions, but the other students didn't seem to see him as a genius, they saw him as a mystery, a person to be avoided. Mrs. Daniels was determined to change that, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. It was the beginning of November when Mrs. Daniels decided to assign the class their biggest project of the semester, a group research project that would challenge their teamwork, creativity, and problem-solving skills. She knew that forcing Marcus to collaborate with others could push him to confront the walls he had built around himself. It was risky, he might withdraw even further, or it might force him to open up. Either way, she hoped it would be a step in the right direction. The project was simple in concept but difficult in execution. The students were asked to research the most pressing issues facing society today: poverty, climate change, mental health, technology, and so on, and present their findings in a way that addressed solutions, not just problems. Mrs. Daniels believed this project would force her students to see beyond their textbooks, to dig deeper into the world around them. On the first day of the project, Mrs. Daniels paired Marcus with Sarah, who had shown the most initiative in class, and two other students, Alex, a natural leader with a knack for organizing, and Megan, who had a gift for storytelling. She felt this diverse group might help draw Marcus out of his shell, if he could tolerate the group dynamic at all. As expected, Marcus seemed uninterested when Mrs. Daniels announced the pairing. He didn't even look up as she gave the instructions, and when Sarah came over to introduce herself, his response was cold. "I already know what I'm doing," Marcus muttered, his eyes glued to the pages of his notebook. "Just tell me when the presentation is." Sarah, undeterred, smiled and tried again. "Come on, Marcus, we're a team. We need to work together. We need your brain to make this work. Let's figure out how we can divide the work and tackle this project." Marcus looked up then, meeting her eyes for the first time in days. His expression was one of indifference, but there was a flicker of something else there, something that suggested he might care more than he was letting on. "I'll do my part. Don't worry about me," he said quietly. Sarah wasn't sure if she should push him or give him space, so she backed off for the moment, content to focus on the task at hand. But as the group began brainstorming, Sarah couldn't ignore the fact that Marcus barely participated. He sat back, letting the others speak, occasionally offering a brief comment, but not contributing to the flow of the conversation. It was Alex who finally spoke up, his voice sharp but understanding. "Marcus, we're all in this together. I get that you're smart, but we need you to talk with us. We can't do this if we don't collaborate." Marcus stiffened, his gaze fixed on the desk. Sarah could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't used to being part of a group, especially one that was asking for his input, not because they needed his answers but because they valued his mind. "Fine," Marcus muttered, standing up suddenly. "I'll do the research on climate change. You guys handle the rest." Alex raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. "All right. But we'll need your help with organizing the data. It's not just about finding facts, it's about making sense of them." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up his things and walked to the back of the classroom, where he could focus on the task without distractions. Mrs. Daniels watched from across the room, sensing that this project could be a turning point for Marcus. But she knew that, for him, the real challenge wasn't just the work, it was the people. That afternoon, Marcus immersed himself in the research, quickly pulling up data and articles on climate change. His mind worked like a machine, rapidly synthesizing information and drawing connections that most students couldn't even begin to understand. The other group members, despite their initial skepticism, began to see Marcus in a new light as he showed them the breadth of his knowledge. But as the days wore on, the tension in the group began to mount. Marcus's reluctance to engage socially was creating friction. Sarah, Alex, and Megan tried their best to include him, but Marcus kept retreating further into his shell. He didn't answer their questions directly, and when he did speak, it was more to correct them than to collaborate. "Look," Sarah said one day, frustrated but trying to be patient. "We need your insights. But you have to meet us halfway. We can't keep guessing what you're thinking." Marcus looked up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. "I don't care about the rest of this project. I just care about the data." "Then you're not listening," Alex shot back. "It's not just about the data. It's about telling a story, about getting people to care about what we're presenting. You're good at facts, but we need to make it matter. You have to trust us with that." For a moment, Marcus's eyes flashed with something, hurt, maybe. It was so fleeting that Sarah almost missed it. But then he closed off again, withdrawing into himself. "I don't trust anyone," he muttered under his breath, but the others heard it. There was silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For the first time, Sarah realized just how deeply Marcus had been scarred by his past. His rejection of connection wasn't out of arrogance, it was out of self-preservation. He had learned long ago that trusting others only led to disappointment. But now, standing before him, Sarah felt an unexpected surge of compassion. "Marcus, I get it," she said softly, her voice full of understanding. "I know you've been hurt before. But we're not going to let you down. You don't have to carry this alone. We're all in this together, okay?" For the first time, Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, as if weighing her words. His face softened slightly, but he still didn't respond. He just nodded, almost imperceptibly. That small gesture was the first breakthrough in a long time. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was something. And for Sarah, Alex, and Megan, it was enough. They now knew that, while Marcus might not open up completely, he was willing to try, just a little bit. As they continued to work together on the project, the team began to gel. Marcus contributed in ways that no one expected, adding his insights with quiet precision. The others, recognizing his genius, began to appreciate the value of his unique perspective. And slowly, Marcus began to see them not as obstacles, but as partners, people he could trust, even if just a little. The project was coming together, but more importantly, something was happening inside Marcus. He was beginning to crack the walls he had built around himself, one small piece at a time. And as the project deadline approached, Mrs. Daniels could see it. The shift. The change. Marcus wasn't just doing the work, he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved to be seen for who he really was. The day of the presentation arrived, and Mrs. Daniels watched her students with a sense of anticipation. She had seen the progress that Marcus had made over the last few weeks, and although the transformation had been subtle, it was undeniable. He had opened up in small ways, stepping out of his self-imposed isolation just a bit at a time. But there was still something about him that felt hidden, something that even his newfound groupmates hadn't yet fully understood. The group of 4 stood together at the front of the classroom, the room buzzing with excitement. Students gathered their materials, preparing to present the results of their collective work on climate change and potential solutions. The others in Marcus's group, Sarah, Alex, and Megan, were energetic, each one clearly ready to shine. But Marcus, despite the hours of preparation he'd poured into the research, was unusually quiet, standing off to the side, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the ground. "All right, everyone, let's get started," Mrs. Daniels said, her voice steady, but there was an edge of emotion in it that she couldn't quite hide. She was proud of all of them, especially Marcus. Alex was the first to speak. His usual confidence carried him through, and he launched into the opening of their presentation. "Good morning, everyone. Today, we're talking about climate change and how it's affecting our world today. We've researched the causes, the consequences, and most importantly, the solutions that we can implement right now to make a difference." His voice was engaging, drawing in the class with the energy of his words. Sarah followed, smoothly taking over. "We divided our project into different aspects of climate change. I'll focus on the human impact, the way this global issue is affecting communities, families, and future generations." Megan added her portion next, offering a compelling argument for renewable energy and sustainable practices, while Alex wrapped up with the potential for activism and the global push for systemic change. But then, it was time for Marcus to speak. The room went silent as he stepped forward, his posture stiff, his voice not quite as confident as it had been when he had been working on the research alone. His peers had learned to expect brilliance from him, but now that they were all watching, it felt like too much. For a moment, Marcus hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. It was like he was stepping into a role that didn't quite fit, one that he hadn't prepared for. But then he looked up at his classmates, his eyes scanning the faces before him. Sarah, Alex, and Megan were watching him intently, waiting for him to deliver. They believed in him. And in that moment, Marcus made a decision. He would no longer hide. Not behind his genius, and not behind his fear. He was going to speak from the heart. "Climate change isn't just a problem for the future," Marcus began, his voice quiet but steady, his words deliberate. "It's happening now, right in front of us. The data is overwhelming. The facts are irrefutable. But what people don't talk about enough is the fact that the solutions to this crisis are right in front of us. We have the technology, we have the knowledge. What we lack is the will to act." He paused, his eyes searching the faces of his classmates. "But that's not the hardest part," he continued, the intensity in his voice growing. "The hardest part is believing that we can make a difference. That's why so many people give up, why they think it's too big, too impossible to fix. But we have the power to change things. It's not a matter of if, we just have to believe it's possible." For a moment, the room was completely still. Marcus's words hung in the air, a truth that felt both undeniable and overwhelming. There was a crackling energy in his voice now, something that had been missing before. He wasn't just speaking about facts, he was speaking about something deeper. Something personal. Mrs. Daniels watched as the class sat in stunned silence. Marcus had done it. He had cracked the wall he had so carefully built around himself. No longer was he just the silent genius in the back of the room. He was a young man with a voice, with something important to say. And the room had heard it. Sarah, ever the optimist, was the first to break the silence, her voice full of warmth. "That was incredible, Marcus," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "You really nailed it." Alex nodded, his usual bravado softened by genuine admiration. "Yeah, man. That was powerful. You really brought it home." Megan, who had always been the quiet one in the group, smiled too, her eyes sparkling. "I didn't know you cared that much," she said softly, but it was clear she was moved. For the first time, Marcus felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt before. It wasn't just the satisfaction of delivering a well-researched speech, or the quiet pride of getting through the presentation. It was something deeper, something that felt like hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could trust others. Hope that he could allow himself to be vulnerable and still be accepted. Hope that he wasn't alone in this world, despite all the evidence to the contrary he had carried with him for so long. He wasn't just Marcus the genius anymore. He was Marcus the person, the human being with feelings, with dreams, and with a future. As the applause began, Mrs. Daniels allowed herself a small, proud smile. She had seen so many students come and go, but this was different. Marcus wasn't just a student who needed help in the classroom, he was a person who needed help to see his own potential. After the presentation, the class was buzzing with energy. The group had done an excellent job, and the class seemed genuinely engaged. But for Marcus, something had changed. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he belonged. And it wasn't just because of his intelligence or the acknowledgement from his classmates, it was because he had let them see him. All of him. And they had accepted him. Mrs. Daniels couldn't help but feel a rush of emotion. It wasn't just about the academic success, it was the personal growth she had witnessed in Marcus. She knew this was just the beginning for him, that he had finally begun to step into the world, not just as a student, but as a person. It was the start of something new, a new beginning for Marcus. And as she watched him stand there, no longer just the quiet genius in the back of the room, Mrs. Daniels realized that the true victory wasn't in the project or the grades. It was in seeing Marcus finally believe in himself. In the weeks following the presentation, the atmosphere in Mrs. Daniels' class began to shift in subtle but profound ways. Marcus was still the quiet, reserved student he had always been, but there was a noticeable change. His presence no longer carried the same air of isolation. He seemed to be more comfortable around his classmates, and although he didn't speak much, when he did, his words were heard with a level of respect he hadn't earned before. It was as if, by revealing a piece of his heart during the presentation, he had allowed others to see him, not just as a brilliant mind, but as a person. And it was that revelation that changed everything. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, but it was undeniable. Sarah, Alex, and Megan continued to reach out to him, including him in conversations and making sure he felt like part of the group. Marcus, for his part, didn't fully open up to them, but he allowed himself to stay in the room. He listened more than he had before, offering his input in small but significant ways. His contributions, once minimal, were now thoughtful and occasionally even inspired. But the most noticeable change was his willingness to trust them, not just with the project, but with himself. Mrs. Daniels couldn't help but marvel at how far Marcus had come. She had always known he was capable of greatness, but she had never expected the journey to be quite so emotional. She had assumed that his intellect would carry him through, that his brilliance alone would be enough to ensure success. But it wasn't just his intelligence that mattered, it was his ability to connect with others, to open up and let people see who he truly was. That was the key to his success, the key to breaking free from the walls he had built around himself. One afternoon, a few weeks after the project had ended, Mrs. Daniels found herself alone in her classroom, preparing for the upcoming semester. As she glanced out the window, lost in thought, she saw Marcus standing in the hallway. His posture was still stiff, his usual solitary demeanor in place, but something in his eyes told a different story. He wasn't completely at ease, but he was no longer the boy who hid in the shadows. The bell rang, and Marcus lingered outside the door, hesitating as if he wasn't sure whether to come in. Mrs. Daniels, sensing an opportunity, called out to him. "Marcus, is everything all right?" He looked at her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Yeah, I was just thinking about the project. It went well, huh?" Mrs. Daniels nodded, walking over to where he stood. "It did. You did great. More than great. You really showed your class what you're capable of." Marcus looked down at his shoes, his fingers fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. "I guess. I never thought anyone would see it that way. I didn't think anyone really cared." Mrs. Daniels paused, choosing her words carefully. She knew this moment could be important for Marcus, that what she said next could help him move even further on his journey. "Marcus, the truth is, you were always capable of so much. But the hardest part is believing in yourself, and letting others believe in you too. You've made a lot of progress in a short amount of time. I'm proud of you." For a long moment, Marcus stood in silence, as if the weight of her words had finally sunk in. He was processing, thinking deeply about the things he had always kept buried. And then, without warning, he spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost vulnerable. "I've always been afraid that if I let people in, they'd just leave. That they wouldn't understand me. So I kept my distance." Mrs. Daniels' heart swelled with empathy. She had known all along that Marcus's distance was a defense mechanism, a way of protecting himself from the pain of rejection. "I know," she said gently. "And I understand. But you don't have to do this alone. You've got people who care about you, who see you, not just your intellect, but who you are as a person." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes wide as if he were hearing something for the first time. "You think people actually see me? Not just, the genius part of me?" Mrs. Daniels smiled, her voice filled with warmth. "Yes, Marcus. I think people see you, the whole you. And I think that's exactly what makes you so special. You don't have to hide anymore. You don't have to be just the smartest person in the room. You can be yourself." There was a long pause, and then Marcus nodded slowly, as if coming to a realization. Maybe I could try that. Maybe I could try trusting people a little more." Mrs. Daniels nodded, her heart lifting at the thought. "That's all I ask. You don't have to change overnight, Marcus. Just take it one step at a time." As Marcus turned to leave, there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. He wasn't fully healed, not yet, but for the first time in his life, he had a glimpse of what it might feel like to truly belong. To trust others. To let them in. The weeks that followed were filled with small, yet significant moments of growth. Marcus continued to excel academically, but his relationships with his peers began to deepen. He was no longer the outsider, the boy who kept his genius locked away from the world. He was Marcus, smart, yes, but also kind, vulnerable, and capable of connection. His classmates, especially Sarah, Alex, and Megan, became his support system. They didn't just admire him for his intellect, they valued him for who he was. Mrs. Daniels watched it all from the sidelines, proud of the young man Marcus had become. She knew that his journey was far from over, that there would still be challenges ahead, that the road to self-acceptance would be long. But for the first time, she saw that Marcus was ready to walk it. He was ready to trust, to open himself up to the possibility of connection, and to believe in the power of those around him. And for Mrs. Daniels, that was the most rewarding part of all. As the semester drew to a close, Marcus walked into Mrs. Daniels' classroom one final time before the holiday break. This time, there was no hesitation in his step. No shyness. He was simply Marcus, himself. "Thanks," he said, his voice steady. "For everything." Mrs. Daniels smiled warmly. "You don't need to thank me, Marcus. You did all the hard work. You believed in yourself when it mattered most." Marcus smiled back, a true smile this time, full of hope and promise. "Maybe," he said quietly, "maybe I'm starting to believe it too." And with that, he walked out of the classroom, leaving behind the walls he had once built around himself, stepping confidently into a future that no longer seemed so impossible. The holidays arrived quickly, and the school year seemed to end on a note of promise. Marcus had spent the break with his family, something he hadn't done in years, not with the same warmth and openness he was now beginning to embrace. He felt a sense of peace that was both foreign and comforting. In the past, he had used the time off to bury himself in books, in academic work that gave him control, but now, there was a different kind of energy inside him, one he wasn't used to but was slowly learning to appreciate. During the break, Marcus found himself thinking a lot about Mrs. Daniels' words. He was still the same person, the same Marcus, but something had shifted within him. He had started to understand what it meant to be seen for more than just his intelligence. He had allowed himself to acknowledge his humanity, his flaws, and his strengths. It felt liberating. At home, things had changed too. Marcus had always been distant with his parents, communicating only when necessary. But now, his mother caught glimpses of the young man who had always been hidden beneath the walls he'd built. He talked to her more, not just about school, but about life, his hopes, his fears, and even his dreams for the future. For the first time, his mother saw him truly, and he saw her too, not just as a caretaker, but as someone with her own dreams and passions. One night, as they sat together in the living room, Marcus's father, who had always been a quiet, supportive figure, turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You've changed, son," his dad said, his tone warm but curious. Marcus looked up from the book he was reading, meeting his father's eyes. "I guess I have," he said, his voice quieter than usual. His dad smiled, placing the newspaper down and leaning back in his chair. "I can tell. You've started letting people in. Your mom and I have noticed. I think it's a good thing. You're not just hiding anymore." It was a small comment, but it meant more to Marcus than he could put into words. For so long, he had lived in his head, disconnected from the world around him. He had buried his emotions and wrapped himself in intellect as a shield. But now, he was learning that the heart needed just as much attention as the mind. The school year resumed, and Marcus returned to Mrs. Daniels' class with a new sense of confidence. He no longer walked into the room with the weight of self-doubt hanging over him. Instead, he walked with a purpose, a quiet assurance that came from understanding himself and his place in the world. His classmates noticed it too. There was a newfound respect in the way they interacted with him, a deeper connection that went beyond the superficial. Sarah, Alex, and Megan welcomed him back with open arms. They were no longer just his project partners, they had become true friends, ones who genuinely cared about him as a person, not just as a source of information. Their friendship wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough for Marcus. One day, Mrs. Daniels called the class together for a special announcement. She had been asked to nominate a student for a prestigious academic competition that would require the participants to present research in front of a panel of distinguished scholars. She stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, and she looked around the classroom, her eyes settling on Marcus. "I've had the privilege of working with many students over the years, but this year, I've seen someone who has truly grown, not just academically, but personally. Marcus, would you come up here, please?" The class turned toward him, and for the first time, Marcus felt a surge of both nervousness and pride. It wasn't about his intelligence, he knew that was already acknowledged. It was about something deeper, something more personal. As he stood and walked to the front of the room, he could feel the weight of the moment. Mrs. Daniels smiled at him, her voice filled with pride. "Marcus, you've shown not only your incredible intellect, but your growth as a person. You've become someone who leads with heart, someone who believes in yourself and others. You've inspired your classmates, and I believe you will continue to inspire those around you for years to come. I'm proud to nominate you for this competition." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady the rush of emotions flooding him. "Thank you, Mrs. Daniels," he said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. The class clapped, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt something he had never felt before, truly seen. It wasn't just about winning or achieving, it was about being recognized for who he was and for the journey he had taken. The weeks leading up to the competition were filled with intense preparation. Marcus worked harder than ever, but this time, it wasn't just about proving something to others. It was about proving something to himself. He wanted to show that he had not only the intelligence to excel, but the heart and determination to succeed. The night of the competition arrived, and as Marcus walked into the grand hall, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. It was a huge event, and the stakes were high. But unlike before, he wasn't nervous in the traditional sense. There was a quiet confidence in him, a belief that he could handle whatever came his way. As he stood before the panel, ready to present his research on climate change and sustainable solutions, he took a deep breath and looked around at the audience. He thought of his classmates, his friends, and Mrs. Daniels, who had believed in him when no one else had. He thought of his family, who had begun to understand him in ways they never had before. He wasn't just Marcus the genius anymore. He was Marcus the person, capable, confident, and ready to take on the world. With a steady hand, he began his presentation. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was authentic. It was him, fully. He spoke from the heart, just as he had in Mrs. Daniels' classroom that day. And when he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room erupted in applause. Marcus stood there, his heart racing, not from fear, but from the exhilaration of knowing he had given his all. And when the judges announced that he had won first place, he knew that the real victory wasn't the award or the recognition, it was in the growth he had experienced, the relationships he had built, and the person he had become. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But for the first time, Marcus felt ready to face whatever came next. Because he knew that no matter where life took him, he had the strength to overcome it. Not just because of his brilliance, but because of his heart. And that, more than anything else, was his greatest achievement. As the days after the competition passed, Marcus found himself caught between two worlds. On one side, there was the world of his achievements, his rising reputation as someone not only brilliant but capable of personal growth. His family, friends, and classmates all saw him as a success, a model of potential. But on the other side, there was the world of his own expectations, the pressure he put on himself to keep moving forward, to keep succeeding, to keep being Marcus the genius. It was a tightrope walk, and Marcus felt the weight of it every day. The feeling of living up to others' expectations, of being the person everyone now thought he was beginning to feel more like a burden than a blessing. Every time someone congratulated him, or every time Mrs. Daniels praised his potential, a part of him recoiled inside. He wanted to be more than just his achievements. He wanted to be Marcus, the person who could laugh, mess up, and be real. But it wasn't always easy to find that balance. It wasn't just about the praise or the recognition, it was the fear of not living up to it. Marcus began to question everything, his friendships, his abilities, and even his place in the world. What if, behind all the compliments and the awards, he wasn't really ready for all of this? What if he was just pretending to be someone he wasn't? One afternoon, after school, Marcus found himself walking aimlessly through the school courtyard. The weight of it all pressed down on him, his homework, his looming future, the expectations placed on his shoulders. He looked around, seeing the students laughing and chatting, their carefree moments mocking the heaviness he felt. Sarah and Alex waved at him from across the courtyard, but Marcus turned away, unable to meet their eyes. He didn't want to burden them with the confusion swirling in his mind. They expected him to be happy, to be the confident, accomplished Marcus. But he wasn't sure he could keep up the act anymore. That evening, he sat in his room, staring at his desk, the notes for a new project scattered in front of him. He should have been working. He knew that. But the more he tried to focus, the more his mind wandered. He thought about how different things had felt just a few months ago. Back then, he had been content to hide in his intellect, to stay distant and untouched. Now, things were different. He had friends, he had success, but he also had this new, looming fear of not being good enough. He felt trapped in a cycle. Every time he succeeded, the pressure to succeed again only increased. Every time someone praised him, it felt like he was being pulled further away from who he truly was. He longed for a moment of peace, for a time when he could just be Marcus, without all the layers of expectation and achievement piled on top of him. The next day, as Marcus sat in Mrs. Daniels' class, he could feel the familiar tension building inside him. It wasn't the pressure of the work itself, it was the pressure to always be perfect, to always be the best. As Mrs. Daniels spoke about the upcoming end-of-year project, Marcus's heart began to race. He had already proven himself with the academic competition, but now it felt like there was something more he had to live up to. Mrs. Daniels noticed the change in him, the way his usual quiet focus seemed to be tinged with worry. She had seen this before, this silent battle between the person a student showed the world and the person they were struggling to become. She paused, looking around the classroom before settling her gaze on Marcus. "Marcus, I want you to remember something," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to always be the best or live up to other people's expectations. What matters most is that you do your best for yourself, that you take each challenge as an opportunity to grow, not as a way to prove something to others." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. They felt like a lifeline, a moment of clarity in a storm of confusion. It was as if Mrs. Daniels had somehow read his mind, understood the invisible weight he had been carrying. He could feel the pressure in his chest loosen just a little, the tension easing ever so slightly. He looked at her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. "But I don't know how to stop," he admitted quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I don't know how to let go of the pressure. It's like I'm stuck in this cycle of always needing to prove myself." Mrs. Daniels nodded, a knowing expression on her face. "I understand, Marcus. But here's the thing, you don't need to prove anything. You've already proven who you are, not by being perfect, but by being brave enough to be yourself. And that's what matters." The room seemed to hold its breath as Marcus absorbed her words. He had never thought of it that way before. It wasn't about being the smartest, the fastest, or the best, it was about being authentic, about living with integrity and honesty, even in the face of doubt. That night, as he lay in bed, Marcus thought about everything Mrs. Daniels had said. The weight that had been pressing on him all these months started to feel a little less heavy. He didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to be anyone but himself. It wasn't an easy realization, but it was one that was starting to sink in. He didn't have to keep running at full speed, trying to outrun the expectations. It was okay to slow down. It was okay to take a breath. The next day, Marcus walked into class with a different mindset. He wasn't ready to give up on his ambitions or his drive, he was still Marcus, after all, but he was ready to be kinder to himself. He would take things one step at a time. It wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. As the day went on, he found himself more present in the moment. When Sarah, Alex, and Megan asked him to join them for lunch, he didn't hesitate. He sat down with them, laughing at their jokes, participating in their conversations. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just focused on the next thing to prove or the next challenge to face. He was simply Marcus, the person who could just be. And for that brief moment, that was enough. As the weeks moved forward, Marcus continued to wrestle with the feelings that had started to surface. The reassurance he'd received from Mrs. Daniels lingered, but the underlying pressure of needing to live up to his success never fully left. No matter how much he tried to let go of the weight of others' expectations, it remained there, a constant companion that lurked in the back of his mind. The school year was winding down, and with it came the looming final exams and projects. Marcus knew that, once again, he would be judged, not just on the results of his work, but on the image he had built over the past several months. His friends, classmates, and even teachers saw him as someone who had it all together, who never struggled, who always succeeded. The truth was, though, Marcus wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending that he had everything under control. At home, his parents were thrilled with his accomplishments. They showered him with praise, constantly reminding him of how proud they were, how proud they had always been. Marcus appreciated it. He did. But there were moments when it felt like too much. Like a mantle he didn't know how to wear anymore. One evening, as he sat at the dinner table with his family, Marcus found himself staring down at his plate, his mind elsewhere. His parents were talking excitedly about his upcoming graduation and how proud they were that their son had excelled in every area. But as they spoke, Marcus couldn't shake the nagging thought that maybe they were seeing him as something he wasn't. Maybe they weren't seeing the struggle inside of him. "I'm proud of you, son," his father said, breaking into his thoughts. "You're going places. Big things. I can feel it." Marcus nodded, giving a small, tight-lipped smile. "Thanks, Dad," he replied, but inside, he felt like a fraud. He hadn't been entirely honest with anyone. Not even with himself. How could he tell them that he felt like he was crumbling under the pressure? That every time someone praised him for his achievements, it felt like another weight being added to his already strained shoulders. His mother caught his expression. "Is something wrong, Marcus?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. Marcus froze. The truth was, he didn't know how to answer. How could he explain that he was overwhelmed by the very success everyone saw as a triumph? He had always been the quiet, driven kid, the one who could handle anything. But now, he wasn't sure if he could keep up the facade. He didn't know how to ask for help without admitting that he wasn't as perfect as everyone thought. "I'm just tired," he muttered, offering the simplest explanation he could muster. His father nodded understandingly. "It's been a long year. You've done well. Don't forget to take some time for yourself." Marcus smiled faintly, grateful for the conversation, but his mind raced. How could he take time for himself when there was always something else to prove? Another test, another project, another milestone to reach. It felt like a never-ending cycle. The next morning, Marcus found himself walking into Mrs. Daniels' classroom again, the weight of his internal battle heavy on his shoulders. The last stretch of the semester was ahead, and he knew he had to finish strong. But the thought of facing those final exams, of proving that he could maintain his perfect record, made him feel trapped. How was he supposed to keep up the image of the genius when he was so unsure of himself? As he sat at his desk, his mind began to wander again. His hands trembled slightly as he set out his notes and textbooks. The pressure felt like a physical presence, sitting on his chest, squeezing the air out of him. The classroom felt suffocating, and for a moment, he longed for the simplicity of those early days when he could hide behind his intellect and not worry about anything else. But Marcus was done hiding. He had spent so long pretending to have everything figured out that he had forgotten what it was like to just be. To be a person who was allowed to feel doubt. Who could fail without fear of being judged. He had never truly understood the value of vulnerability until now, until the weight of trying to be perfect started to break him down from the inside. At lunch that day, Sarah noticed the shift in him. She had been watching him closely for the past few days, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Normally, Marcus was sharp, confident, and even a little witty. But lately, he had been distant. His eyes were more tired, and his smile didn't seem as genuine. "Hey, Marcus," she said softly, as she sat down across from him at the cafeteria table. "What's going on with you? You haven't been yourself lately." Marcus hesitated, unsure how to respond. He didn't want to burden Sarah with his confusion, his fear of failure, his doubts about everything he had been working for. But the kindness in her voice broke through his defenses. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like I've been living in this bubble, trying to meet everyone's expectations, but now I feel like it's all falling apart. I'm just tired of pretending. I don't know if I'm good enough anymore." Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "Marcus," she said gently, "you don't have to pretend with us. We see you. The real you. You don't have to live up to anyone else's standards but your own. You've already done so much. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." Her words struck him like a bolt of lightning. For the first time in months, he felt like he was allowed to breathe. Like he didn't have to keep carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations on his shoulders. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice more steady now. I've been so focused on being perfect for everyone else that I forgot about what I need. What I want. The realization was freeing. For the first time, Marcus understood that he didn't have to bear the weight of the world. He didn't have to carry everyone's hopes on his shoulders. His journey was his own, and it was okay to take it one step at a time. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus allowed himself to believe that it was enough just to be who he was. As Marcus continued to navigate the final stretch of his school year, things began to shift inside him. After his conversation with Sarah, something had changed in his outlook. It wasn't an instant transformation, but the heavy weight he had been carrying around seemed a little easier to bear. The realization that he didn't have to meet anyone's expectations but his own gave him a sense of freedom he hadn't known he needed. He no longer felt the suffocating pressure to prove something to the world. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself more focused in class, but not because he felt the need to be the best. He was simply engaged, interested in the material because he genuinely wanted to learn, not because he was trying to live up to some ideal of perfection. It felt good. It felt real. His relationship with his friends deepened as well. Sarah, Alex, and Megan had become his anchors, people who saw him for who he truly was, not for the image he had been trying so hard to uphold. They didn't care about his grades or his genius IQ. They cared about Marcus, his thoughts, his dreams, and even his struggles. And that was more than enough. One afternoon, as the final exams loomed closer, Marcus sat on the steps outside the school with Sarah. It was a beautiful day, the kind of late spring afternoon where the sun hung lazily in the sky, and the air smelled fresh with the promise of summer. Students were walking by, their chatter mingling with the sound of birdsong. "I think I'm ready for the exams," Marcus said, a quiet confidence in his voice. It surprised him that he could say those words and mean them. He didn't feel the crushing weight of expectation anymore. Instead, he felt prepared in a way that wasn't tied to any external pressure. He had studied. He had worked hard. But most importantly, he had given himself permission to be okay with whatever outcome came. Sarah smiled at him, her eyes reflecting a warmth that made Marcus feel understood. "I'm proud of you," she said. "For not just pushing yourself to succeed, but for being okay with who you are, no matter what happens." Marcus looked down at his hands, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the outline of his notebook. "Thanks," he said, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "It feels like I've finally figured out that it's okay to not be perfect. It's okay to be scared sometimes, or unsure. I don't have to be the smartest guy in the room all the time. I just need to be me." The words hung in the air between them for a moment. Sarah's smile grew wider. "That's the most important thing you can be, Marcus. And the world will see that, too." That evening, Marcus sat at his desk, preparing for the exams the next day. His notes were spread out before him, but this time, he didn't feel the usual pressure to cram or push himself to the limit. He was calm, methodical, and focused. For the first time in a long while, studying didn't feel like a race against time. It felt like a process of discovery. He knew the material, but more importantly, he knew himself. The morning of the exams arrived, and Marcus walked into the classroom with a quiet confidence that surprised him. He no longer felt the nerves that had once consumed him before big tests. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to do his best. The exam papers were handed out, and as Marcus began to write, he found that the questions seemed less daunting than they had before. The pressure that had once clouded his thoughts was gone, replaced by a clear focus. He answered each question methodically, taking his time, knowing that his mind was sharp. But more importantly, he felt a sense of peace as he worked through the test. When the exams were over, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. It wasn't the relief that came from knowing he had aced the test, it was the relief of knowing that he had done it his way, without the weight of expectation holding him down. He had done his best, and that was enough. As the end of the school year drew nearer, Marcus began to reflect on the journey he had taken. The person he had been when the school year started, the quiet, withdrawn kid who hid behind his intellect, felt like a distant memory. In his place stood a young man who was more in tune with who he was and who he wanted to be. The summer break arrived, and with it came a sense of freedom. Marcus spent time with his friends, taking long walks and having deep conversations about life, the future, and everything in between. He felt lighter, more open to the possibilities that lay ahead. There was still so much to learn, so much to discover, but Marcus wasn't afraid anymore. And in those moments of quiet reflection, as he walked through the streets of his neighborhood with his friends by his side, Marcus realized that the true measure of success wasn't in grades or accolades. It was in the strength to face the challenges, to be true to oneself, and to allow room for growth. Marcus knew that the road ahead would have its obstacles, its moments of doubt, and its struggles. But he also knew that he was no longer walking that road alone. He had friends, he had support, and most importantly, he had learned how to be himself, no matter what. And that was the greatest achievement of all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The summer arrived with its usual warm embrace, a welcome break from the school year that had been filled with challenges, growth, and revelation. For Marcus, this summer felt different. It wasn't just about taking a break from schoolwork, it was about taking a break from the expectations he had been carrying for so long. He had spent so many months trying to live up to the image others had of him that he hadn't realized how much it had been weighing him down. Now, with the summer stretching out before him, he felt a sense of freedom he had never experienced before. It started with the small things. Marcus woke up later than usual, savoring the quiet mornings that were his alone. He enjoyed the luxury of doing nothing in particular, of not having to meet deadlines or academic goals. It felt strange at first, to not be chasing something, but over time, he grew accustomed to it. There was a sense of peace in not constantly measuring his success against some invisible bar. For once, he could just exist. One afternoon, Sarah invited Marcus and Alex to go to a nearby park. She had suggested it as a way to just relax, get some fresh air, and talk about whatever came to mind. No school pressure, no looming deadlines, just friends, nature, and conversation. As they walked through the park, Marcus noticed how different this summer was from any other he could remember. There was no rush, no pressure, just an easy, flowing connection with his friends. "I've been thinking a lot," Sarah said as they found a spot near the edge of the pond, settling down on the grass. "About the future, you know. About what comes next." Marcus chuckled. "Sounds like the summer's making you philosophical," he teased, but inside, he found himself agreeing. The future had been something he had never truly considered, at least not in terms of what he wanted. He had been so focused on meeting the expectations of others, so absorbed in proving himself, that he hadn't taken a moment to think about his own desires. "I mean, what's next for all of us?" Sarah continued, leaning back on the grass. "I know we've all got our ideas, but there's so much pressure to do what's expected. We can't just keep running on autopilot forever, right?" Alex nodded in agreement, looking out at the peaceful pond. "I don't want to just go to college because that's what's expected of me. I want to figure out what I'm passionate about, you know." Marcus looked between his two friends, feeling a sudden sense of clarity. It wasn't just about the immediate future, about getting through school, proving himself in the classroom, or even living up to his parents' dreams. It was about discovering who he really was, not just academically, but as a person. "Yeah," Marcus said, a quiet conviction in his voice. "I think I've spent too much of my life trying to fit into a mold that wasn't really mine. I'm starting to realize that I don't have to follow the path everyone expects me to take. I can decide what I want to do." It was a turning point for Marcus. For so long, he had been living a life dictated by others, his parents, his teachers, his peers. Now, he felt ready to carve out his own path, to embrace the unknown, and to make decisions that were true to himself, not based on what anyone else thought he should do. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of excitement about the future. The pressure that had once consumed him, the fear of failing, of not living up to his potential, had faded. Instead, he felt a sense of possibility. He could choose his next step. He didn't have to have everything figured out, but he could start to explore what really mattered to him. What did he want to do with his life? What made him come alive? The next few weeks were filled with exploration. Marcus spent more time with Sarah and Alex, talking about their future plans, their dreams, and their fears. They all shared the same feeling of uncertainty, but it wasn't the paralyzing kind of fear that had gripped Marcus before. It was a fear that was tempered with hope, a recognition that no one had all the answers, but that they could still shape their own stories. Marcus also took some time for himself. He reconnected with his love of reading, spending long hours diving into books on everything from history to philosophy to art. He had always loved learning, but now it felt like he was doing it for the sake of his own curiosity, not to impress anyone or meet a standard. It was liberating. One evening, as he was reading on the porch of his house, his mother came outside, a cup of tea in her hands. She sat down next to him, her presence warm and comforting. "You've been really quiet lately, Marcus," she said, her voice soft. "How are you feeling?" Marcus looked up at her, surprised at the simplicity of the question. For the first time in a while, he realized how much he had been holding inside, keeping his emotions hidden behind the mask of achievement. "I'm feeling good," he said after a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not as stressed anymore. I'm not trying to be perfect all the time. I'm learning to just be, you know." His mother smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I'm glad to hear that. It's okay to be imperfect, Marcus. You don't have to be everything to everyone. You're enough as you are." Her words filled him with warmth. For so long, he had thought he needed to prove his worth through achievement. But now, he was realizing that his worth didn't depend on accolades or external validation. He was worthy simply because he was Marcus. As the summer days slowly passed, Marcus continued to find himself. He explored new hobbies, deepened his friendships, and looked inward, wondering what the next chapter of his life would hold. The uncertainty of the future no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a blank canvas, waiting for him to paint his own story. And as the last few weeks of summer flew by, Marcus couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had brought him to this point, the struggles, the victories, the doubts, and the triumphs. They had all shaped him into the person he was becoming. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Marcus was okay with that. He didn't need to have it all figured out. All he needed was the courage to keep moving forward, to embrace the unknown with an open heart, and to trust that wherever the journey took him, he would be ready. As the summer wound down, a sense of anticipation began to settle in Marcus. The looming decision of what to do after high school was no longer a daunting question. It had become an exciting opportunity for self-discovery. He had spent so much of his life running on autopilot, doing what was expected of him without truly considering what he wanted. Now, Marcus felt like he was standing at the edge of a new chapter, one where he could make choices that felt right for him, not for anyone else. The question was no longer, what will people think, but instead, what makes me feel alive? And that was both thrilling and terrifying. He had always been told that his intellect and success in school would lead him down a clear path, an Ivy League college, a high-paying job, and an impressive career. But Marcus wasn't so sure anymore. He had learned that following the conventional route wasn't the only way to be successful. He could choose his own path, one that was more in tune with who he truly was. One evening, Marcus found himself sitting on the porch with his father. The evening sky was painted with soft hues of orange and pink as the sun began to set, casting a peaceful glow over their neighborhood. Marcus had been contemplating his future for weeks now, but it wasn't until this moment, sitting quietly with his dad, that he finally felt ready to speak about it. His father, always the optimist, had been talking about his own past decisions and how everything had worked out in the end. It was the kind of conversation Marcus had heard 100 times before, but tonight, it felt different. He felt ready to share his thoughts. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice more serious than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next after high school." His father glanced over, sensing the change in tone. "Yeah. You thinking about college?" Marcus nodded, but his mind wasn't entirely on that path anymore. "I don't know, Dad. Everyone keeps talking about the next step being college, but I'm not sure it's the right fit for me. I've been trying to figure out what I really want, and I don't think I'm ready to follow the same path everyone else is taking." His father sat up a little straighter, clearly surprised by the admission. For a moment, there was silence between them as Marcus' words sunk in. His dad had always been proud of his academic achievements, and the idea that Marcus might not follow the typical college trajectory was new. "So what are you thinking, then?" his father asked, his voice gentle, trying to understand his son's sudden shift in perspective. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment where everything could change. "I've been considering taking a gap year. Maybe travel a little, explore new things, volunteer, or even try working in fields I'm interested in. I want to take some time to figure out what truly excites me. I'm not in a rush to follow a set path." His father looked thoughtful. Marcus could see him processing the idea. His dad had always been a firm believer in hard work and achieving goals, so the idea of taking time off before diving into college was a shift from the norm. "I can't say I expected that," his father said with a half smile. "But I get it. You've been under a lot of pressure. Maybe this could be the right thing for you." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. His father hadn't reacted with disappointment or frustration. Instead, he seemed open to the idea. "I don't want to just follow a plan because it's what everyone else is doing," Marcus continued. "I want to be sure that whatever I choose to do is something I'm passionate about. I've spent so much of my life doing what I thought others wanted me to do, but I don't think I've ever really stopped to think about what I want." His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son, I can't tell you what the right choice is. But I can tell you this, you're a smart, capable young man. You'll figure it out. Take the time you need. Don't rush into anything." It was the kind of reassurance Marcus had longed for, permission to explore his own desires without fear of disappointing those around him. He hadn't expected his father to be so understanding, but in that moment, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The decision wasn't an easy one, but Marcus knew it was the right choice. He wasn't abandoning his future, he was giving himself the chance to explore it on his own terms. A gap year would give him the time and space to grow, to find new passions, and to see the world from a different perspective. As he spent the rest of the evening reflecting on the conversation, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The next day, he made the call to the college he had been accepted to, informing them that he would be deferring his enrollment for a year. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but as the words left his mouth, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace. He wasn't running away from the future. He was simply taking a step back to understand it better. The news spread quickly among his friends. Sarah was thrilled to hear it, and Alex was more than supportive, even suggesting that they all take a trip together before they went their separate ways. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt the joy of embracing the unknown, the excitement of creating his own path. "I think this is the best decision you could make," Sarah said when they met up later that week. "You're going to find so many amazing things out there. And who knows? You might find something that changes everything." Marcus smiled. "I hope so. I really do." The days that followed were filled with new conversations, new plans, and new ideas. Marcus didn't know exactly what the next year would bring, but he knew it was the beginning of something powerful. The uncertainty was no longer something to fear, it was an invitation to explore, to grow, and to learn more about himself and the world around him. He had always been someone who valued intelligence and academic success, but now he was beginning to understand that true wisdom came from experience, from stepping outside of the confines of expectations, and from embracing the unknown. Marcus was ready to discover a new version of himself, one that wasn't bound by the expectations of others, but defined by his own desires and choices. And so, with the horizon wide open before him, Marcus set out on a journey that would change everything. As the summer heat began to fade and the crispness of fall crept into the air, Marcus found himself preparing for the unknown. His gap year was officially set in motion, and although the initial excitement still buzzed within him, a part of him couldn't deny that he felt nervous. It was one thing to talk about taking time off from school, but it was another to actually step into it. What would the next few months hold? What if he ended up regretting the decision? But every time those thoughts crept in, he reminded himself of the decision he'd made, a decision to explore life on his own terms. He didn't want to be stuck in a box, following someone else's timeline. He wanted to experience the world beyond the classroom, to immerse himself in real-life experiences that would teach him things no textbook ever could. The world was vast, and he had only just begun to scratch the surface. The first part of Marcus's plan was to travel. Not to a far-flung destination, but to visit different cities in the U.S. He wanted to learn about the diversity of culture, food, and people in places he had never really explored. He booked tickets to New York City, Chicago, and San Francisco, 3 cities that represented a cross-section of American life, from the bustling streets of Manhattan to the artistic vibe of the Bay Area. His first stop was New York City, a city that both intimidated and fascinated him. It had always been a symbol of endless opportunity, but also a place where people could easily get lost in the shuffle. As he stepped off the plane and into the swarming streets of Times Square, he felt the electricity of the city hit him immediately. The towering skyscrapers, the flashing lights, and the constant hum of activity overwhelmed his senses. He spent the first few days wandering the streets, seeing the sights, and meeting people along the way. There was something intoxicating about New York, its fast-paced energy, the melting pot of cultures, and the way everyone seemed to have a dream they were chasing. It was easy to see why so many people came to the city to reinvent themselves. But despite the excitement of it all, Marcus felt something else, too. He realized that, in many ways, he was chasing his own dream. He wasn't sure exactly what that dream was yet, but he could feel it forming, just beneath the surface. New York had given him a taste of something new, something vibrant, and he felt a growing sense of possibility. One afternoon, as he was strolling through Central Park, he struck up a conversation with a street artist named Layla. She was painting a mural on the side of a small building, and the vivid colors of her work immediately caught Marcus's attention. "Hey, I love your art," he said, his curiosity piqued. Layla smiled, wiping a bit of paint off her hands. "Thanks. I've been working on this piece for a while. It's about how people see the world differently, you know. It's a reminder that we're all living in the same world, but we all have our own lens." Marcus nodded, impressed. "That's deep. I've always been into learning about people, how they think, how they see things. I guess that's why I decided to take a break from school. I wanted to experience life from a different perspective." Layla looked thoughtful for a moment, before saying, "I get that. Sometimes, stepping outside the routine helps you realize what you truly want. School's great, but life's out here, in the real world. You've got to make your own path, just like I'm doing with my art." Her words stuck with Marcus. He had been so focused on the future that he hadn't taken the time to think about how he could shape his life in the present. The idea of creating something uniquely his, something that wasn't bound by the constraints of school or society, resonated deeply with him. Maybe this was what he needed to explore during his gap year, not just travel and experience new places, but also dig deeper into his own passions and creative side. Over the next few weeks, Marcus continued his journey, visiting Chicago and San Francisco, learning more about the diversity of people, their stories, and their paths. Each city gave him a new perspective. Chicago, with its rich history and deep sense of community, made Marcus appreciate the power of tradition and culture. San Francisco, with its entrepreneurial spirit and artistic energy, sparked ideas about innovation and creativity. And through it all, Marcus began to see the threads that connected these places, how people everywhere were just trying to find their place in the world, to follow their passion and dreams, in whatever form that might take. Throughout his travels, Marcus kept in touch with Sarah, Alex, and his parents, sharing stories, experiences, and reflections. His conversations with them were different now, more reflective, more meaningful. They were still his close friends, but they were also witnesses to his transformation, to the way he was growing into someone more confident, more self-aware, and more connected to the world around him. In Chicago, Sarah texted him, "You've always been so focused on doing well in school, but now you're learning how to really live. I'm so proud of you for taking this leap." Marcus smiled at the message, feeling a deep sense of appreciation for the friends who had supported him through his journey. They had always believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. And now, he was beginning to understand why. One night in San Francisco, while sitting at a cafe with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge, Marcus had a moment of clarity. The bustling city around him, the people talking, the music playing, and the distant sound of the waves, it all felt so alive. This was the kind of life he had been yearning for, one that was filled with experiences, not just accomplishments. He pulled out his journal and began to write. The world is bigger than any classroom or test. It's full of people who are trying, failing, growing, and learning. The more I see, the more I realize that there's no one right way to live. No formula for success. We all find our own path, and it's okay if that path is different from what others expect. It's okay to take the time to explore, to make mistakes, and to figure it out. This journey is mine. As he wrote, Marcus realized that his gap year wasn't just about finding his passion. It was about finding himself, discovering who he was outside of the expectations of others. The lessons he had learned in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco weren't just about the places they'd visited or the people they'd met. They were about him. His own story was unfolding, and he was ready to embrace whatever came next. His gap year was just the beginning of a larger journey, a journey that would take him far beyond the classroom and into the heart of the world itself. The months of Marcus's gap year had flown by faster than he could have imagined. He had already traveled to several cities, met a host of fascinating people, and explored parts of himself that had been buried beneath the weight of expectations. But despite all the progress he'd made, Marcus still hadn't fully figured out what came next. He had learned so much, but there was a deep part of him that still felt like something was missing. The questions that had plagued him before, about his future, his passions, his purpose, remained unanswered. One of the places Marcus had always wanted to visit was the small town of Cedar Ridge, a picturesque community nestled in the mountains of North Carolina. His parents had talked about it often when he was younger, about its quiet charm and close-knit community. It wasn't like any of the other places Marcus had been, and he wanted to see it for himself. Cedar Ridge felt like the opposite of everything Marcus had experienced so far, the hustle and bustle of the cities, the fast-paced, digital world. Here, he imagined, life moved slower, and people had time to really see each other. As soon as he arrived, Marcus could feel the difference. The air was fresh and crisp, the streets quiet, and the people were warm and welcoming. He rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town and spent his days hiking, writing, and reflecting. Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where people still waved at each other as they passed by, where the local diner knew everyone by name. It was peaceful, and for a while, Marcus felt like he could breathe deeply again. But it wasn't until one crisp morning in October that Marcus's time in Cedar Ridge truly took a turn. He had been exploring one of the many trails when he stumbled upon an old bookstore nestled in the heart of the town. It was a quaint, two-story building with a sign that read, "The Old Pages Bookshop." The moment he stepped inside, the scent of aged paper and ink filled his nostrils. The shelves were stacked high with books of every genre, and the air was thick with the quiet murmurs of the place. Marcus immediately felt drawn to it. The shop was unlike anything he had seen in the more commercialized cities he'd visited. It felt personal, as though each book had a history, a story to tell. Marcus spent hours in the bookstore, flipping through old novels, history books, and poetry collections. It was a peaceful kind of escape, one that he had grown to appreciate over the past few months. As he was about to leave, his eyes landed on a dusty shelf in the back corner labeled Local Authors. Curious, he made his way toward it, intrigued by the idea of finding something new, something authentic. And that was when he saw her. A young woman in her early 30s stood in front of the shelf, carefully arranging books. She had long brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and wore a pair of oversized glasses that made her look both intellectual and approachable. She didn't notice Marcus at first, but as he reached for a book, she turned around and smiled. "Find anything interesting?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. Marcus smiled back. "Definitely. I'm just browsing, though. I haven't come across anything like this before." She nodded. "Most people come in here just to look at the usual bestsellers. But we've got some hidden gems in the back." "What's your name?" Marcus asked, his curiosity piqued. "I'm Emma. I own the shop," she replied with a small laugh. "It's kind of a family business. My grandmother started it years ago, and I've been running it ever since." Marcus was immediately intrigued. There was something about Emma, her passion for books, the way she spoke about the shop. It was as if she had found her place in the world in a way that Marcus hadn't yet. "Running a bookstore must be a dream job," Marcus said, leaning casually against the shelf. "I mean, you get to be surrounded by stories all day long." Emma shrugged, though her eyes twinkled with excitement. "It's definitely not glamorous, but it's fulfilling. I love sharing stories with people, hearing what resonates with them. It's a job that lets you connect with others in a way that's rare. Especially these days when everything's so fast-paced." Marcus considered this. It sounded peaceful, yet purposeful. In a way, Emma had created something that was both personal and essential, something he longed to find for himself. It made him think about his own future, about what kind of life he wanted to live. Maybe he wasn't ready to decide exactly what that looked like, but hearing Emma talk about her work, it made him wonder if it was possible to build a life out of something meaningful, something that involved connecting with people on a deeper level. "Do you ever think about doing something else?" Marcus asked, his voice casual but probing. Emma paused before answering, as if choosing her words carefully. "I think about it all the time. But then I come back here, to the shop, and it just feels right. Maybe it's not the most glamorous job in the world, but it's the one that speaks to me. And that's what matters. I think we all spend too much time chasing after what we think we should want, when really, what we need is to listen to what makes us feel alive." Her words struck a chord with Marcus. For the first time in a long time, he was reminded that there was no one right path to success or fulfillment. Some people found meaning in traditional careers, while others found it in small, quiet lives, like Emma's. He had been so focused on the future, on his next big move, but he had never really stopped to think about what was truly meaningful to him in the present. Over the next few days, Marcus found himself returning to the bookstore. He and Emma would chat about books, life, and the future. Each conversation felt like a piece of a puzzle falling into place. It wasn't just the bookstore he was coming back for, it was the way Emma seemed to have found her own sense of peace, her own sense of purpose. She wasn't waiting for life to happen, she was making it happen, one day at a time. Marcus knew that he hadn't figured everything out yet, but he was starting to see something clearer than before. The future didn't have to be a race to success or achievement. It could be about finding moments of meaning, building connections with others, and trusting that the right path would reveal itself when the time was right. As he left the bookstore on the last day of his stay in Cedar Ridge, Marcus felt a sense of calm wash over him. He wasn't rushing anymore. He was learning to savor the journey. And that, in itself, was enough. The following weeks passed quickly as Marcus continued his travels, but something shifted within him after his time in Cedar Ridge. He'd thought he would return home with all the answers, ready to dive into his next big chapter, but instead, he felt even more uncertain. The world was vast, full of endless possibilities, but now, it seemed even harder to pin down exactly where he belonged. He knew that traveling had opened his eyes to countless perspectives, but that same freedom left him feeling exposed, unsure of what came next. He wasn't the same person who had left for his gap year, but he wasn't quite sure who he was becoming either. With his trip through the West and South behind him, Marcus returned home to his family in Charlotte. It felt odd at first, stepping back into the house where he had spent so much of his childhood. The familiarity of it all was both comforting and disorienting. He could sense the changes in his parents' demeanor as well. They were proud of him, but there was an unspoken expectation to get back on track with his life. "Welcome home, son." His father greeted him with open arms as Marcus entered the house. Marcus hugged him, but the gesture felt different now, less about homecoming, more about reconciling who he had been with who he was now. It was as though both he and the house had moved on, but in different ways. "How was the trip?" his mother asked, eyeing him curiously from the kitchen, where the smell of homemade pasta sauce lingered in the air. "It was good, Mom," Marcus replied, trying to sound as if he had it all figured out. "Really eye-opening. I learned a lot." His mother smiled warmly. "Well, we're glad to have you back. But now, you're back in reality, son. What's next?" It was that question. The one Marcus had been avoiding. What was next? He had no concrete answer for it, no neat little box to check off. As he sat down at the kitchen table with his family, his mind raced. They were eager to know what his next move was, but he wasn't sure he even knew what direction he wanted to go in anymore. The more they asked, the more Marcus realized that his time away hadn't solved everything, it had only made the questions louder. The dreams he had before leaving seemed both far away and too close, like a door he wasn't quite ready to walk through. He thought of Emma again, standing in the bookstore, talking about finding meaning in small, personal things. But he wasn't sure he could give up the ambition that had always driven him, the desire to prove himself. The balance between the two seemed impossible. A few days after his return, Sarah sent him a message. "I miss you, Marcus. Let's meet up this weekend. I want to hear all about your gap year and what's going on in your head. We need to catch up." He texted her back, agreeing to meet. It had been too long since they'd really talked about everything. Sarah always had a way of making things clearer, even when he couldn't articulate what he was feeling. When they met at their favorite cafe, Sarah gave him a long, assessing look, as if she was evaluating the changes that had taken place over the past few months. She didn't speak immediately, but there was a knowing look in her eyes. "So," she said finally, after taking a sip of her coffee. "How do you feel about coming back home? How's the family?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath. "It's a little weird, to be honest. It's like nothing's changed here, but everything has changed inside me. I'm not the same person I was when I left." Sarah nodded, the understanding evident in her gaze. "I get that. It's like you went on this amazing journey and experienced all these incredible things, and now, you're supposed to just fit back into the life you had before. But you can't, can you?" "No, I can't," Marcus admitted. "I don't know if I want to fit back into that life. It feels small now. Like there's more out there, but I don't know how to chase it." She smiled knowingly. "That's the problem with growth, Marcus. You see the world differently, and suddenly, the things you used to do just don't feel right anymore. But it doesn't mean you're stuck. It means you have to reinvent your next steps." Marcus sat up straighter, her words hitting a chord deep within him. "Reinvent, that's exactly what I've been thinking. But I don't know how to do it. How do you move forward when you don't know where you're going?" Sarah's expression softened, and she reached across the table to place her hand on his. You don't have to have everything figured out right now. You have time, Marcus. Just take things step by step. You've got so much potential, you don't need to rush it. The world is open to you. Her words comforted him in a way that he hadn't realized he needed. Marcus had always been the type of person who prided himself on having a plan, but the gap year had taught him that not everything could be planned. Sometimes, it was okay to not know the next step. Sometimes, the journey itself was the answer. As they continued talking, Sarah offered him some insight that hit home. She reminded him of his passion for helping others, the way he'd always been drawn to mentoring younger students and getting involved in community projects. It wasn't something Marcus had thought about in a while, but suddenly, the idea of pursuing something that wasn't just about his own success felt right. Maybe you could work with kids, Sarah suggested. You've always been great at explaining things in ways people can understand. You could tutor, or even get involved with after-school programs. You've got so much to offer. The thought of teaching, mentoring, and making a difference in someone else's life brought a sense of calm to Marcus. It felt like a small piece of the puzzle that had been missing. Perhaps it wasn't about fitting into the mold of what people expected of him, it was about carving out his own niche, one that aligned with his strengths and passions. Yeah, Marcus said, a slow smile forming on his face. Maybe that's exactly what I need to do next. Thanks, Sarah. She smiled back. Anytime. You'll figure it out, Marcus. You always do. As he left the cafe, Marcus felt lighter than he had in weeks. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he had a direction. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The weeks following his conversation with Sarah marked a shift in Marcus's approach to life. He wasn't entirely sure how it would unfold, but he had decided to follow Sarah's advice and take a leap of faith, embracing the possibility of working with young people. It felt right, even though he still had lingering doubts. But for the first time, Marcus felt that the idea of helping others, rather than seeking his own personal success, offered him a sense of purpose that he hadn't known he was missing. He started researching opportunities in Charlotte, looking for ways he could contribute to the community. Marcus had always been someone who thrived in educational settings, whether it was tutoring friends in high school or volunteering at summer camps. The idea of working with kids wasn't completely foreign to him, but now it felt more like his path was calling him back to something familiar, something meaningful. After a week of searching, Marcus found a position for a tutoring program at a local community center. The program focused on helping underprivileged children, particularly those who struggled in school. It wasn't a huge commitment at first, a few hours a week after school, but Marcus was drawn to it immediately. The thought of guiding these kids, giving them the tools they needed to succeed, felt like something he could get behind. He signed up without hesitation, not caring that it wasn't the glamorous, fast-paced life he once thought he'd pursue. This was the real work. It wasn't about being recognized, and it wasn't about accolades. It was about making a difference, even if it was in small, quiet ways. Marcus met with the program coordinator, a woman named Carla, who had been running the after-school tutoring initiative for over a decade. Carla was passionate about the work she did, and her genuine enthusiasm was contagious. She explained the structure of the program and introduced him to some of the students he would be working with. You'll be working with a group of middle schoolers, Carla said, handing Marcus a binder with details about the students. Most of them struggle with reading and math, but they have potential. What they need is someone who believes in them. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Believing in them. That wasn't just a task, it was a responsibility. He realized that his role wouldn't just be about teaching the subject matter, but about instilling confidence, helping these kids understand that they were capable of more than they thought. The first day of tutoring arrived, and Marcus found himself standing outside the community center, heart pounding with nervous energy. He had worked with kids before, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just about passing on knowledge, it was about shaping their future. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped inside. The students were a lively bunch, full of energy and curiosity. Some were eager to learn, while others seemed disinterested, distracted by the noise of their world outside. Marcus wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that he would need to be patient. He would have to meet them where they were, not where he wished they'd be. For the first few sessions, Marcus struggled to find his rhythm. He was used to a structured, academic environment, but the reality of these kids' lives was messier than that. Some of them came from broken homes, others had little support at school. Still, Marcus persisted, finding ways to make his lessons engaging and offering encouragement wherever he could. One student, a boy named Malik, stood out to him. Malik was quiet, withdrawn, and reluctant to engage in class discussions. He had a tough exterior, but Marcus could tell there was more to him than he let on. During one of their sessions, Marcus worked with Malik on a reading assignment, and for the first time, the boy spoke up. "I don't like reading," Malik said, pushing the book away from him. "It's too hard. I'll never get it." Marcus paused, looking at Malik, understanding the frustration in his words. "I get it," Marcus said softly. "But sometimes, when something's hard, it's because we haven't figured out how to approach it yet. We just need to take it step by step. Want to try?" Malik hesitated, but then he nodded. Together, they worked through the reading. Marcus didn't rush him, instead, they took their time, breaking the text down into manageable pieces. Slowly, Malik's confidence started to build, and by the end of the session, he had read through an entire page, something he hadn't thought possible when they started. "You did it," Marcus said, offering him a small, encouraging smile. Malik grinned, surprised by his own success. "I guess I did." That moment made Marcus's heart swell with pride. It wasn't just about teaching, it was about helping Malik believe that he could do it. And as much as Marcus had questioned his own purpose, he realized that in this moment, he was exactly where he needed to be. As the weeks passed, Marcus's bond with his students deepened. He saw their struggles, their triumphs, their growth. With each lesson, he began to understand what Emma had meant when she talked about finding fulfillment in the small things. It wasn't about accolades or recognition, it was about making an impact on the people you met along the way. But even as he found his place with these students, Marcus knew that he couldn't stop questioning his journey. He had left behind a world of uncertainty, only to step into another one. Could this truly be the path he was meant to follow? Would helping kids like Malik be enough, or was there something more that he still needed to discover about himself? That question lingered in his mind, but for now, Marcus was content. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was making a difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others. And that, he realized, was a good place to start. Marcus spent the next few months immersed in his tutoring program. Every week, he grew more connected with the kids he worked with. He was seeing the fruits of his labor. Malik, once so withdrawn, was now engaging in class, asking questions, and even starting to help some of the other students. But despite the progress, something still gnawed at Marcus. The weight of his own doubts about his place in the world continued to pull at him. Each day after tutoring, as he sat alone in his room, Marcus found himself reflecting on what his future held. He had committed to this path, to help others, but was it truly enough? Was it just a temporary solution, or was he truly aligned with his deeper purpose? Sarah's words echoed in his mind, "You don't have to have everything figured out right now. Just take things step by step." Yet Marcus found that step by step wasn't always easy. He was doing meaningful work, but it wasn't enough to quell the restlessness within him. There was a lingering feeling that something bigger, something more profound, was waiting for him, if he could just figure out what it was. One evening, Marcus received a text from Emma. It had been a while since they last spoke, but he had often thought about her in the months since their time in Cedar Ridge. He wasn't sure what they were anymore, just friends, or something more, but his thoughts often wandered back to their time together, their deep conversations, and the way she had opened his eyes to new possibilities. "Hey Marcus. Been thinking about you a lot. Want to catch up sometime soon? I'd love to hear what you've been up to." Marcus hesitated before responding. He wasn't sure if he was ready to revisit his feelings for Emma, but a part of him longed for that connection again. After all, the last time they spoke, she had left him with so much to think about, so much to ponder. Maybe now, after everything he'd experienced, he could find the clarity he needed. "I'd love that. When are you free?" A few days later, they met at the same cafe they had sat in just before he left for his gap year. The smell of coffee and pastries in the air made Marcus feel strangely nostalgic. Emma was already there when he arrived, sitting by the window with a warm smile that made his heart flutter. "Marcus," she greeted him, standing to hug him. "It's so good to see you." He returned the hug, feeling both the comfort of familiarity and the weight of the time that had passed since they last saw each other. "I've missed you, Emma," Marcus admitted, sitting down across from her. "I missed you too. So, tell me everything. How's the gap year been? What's been going on in that head of yours?" She leaned forward, her eyes curious and warm. Marcus took a deep breath and began telling her about the tutoring program, about his experiences with the kids, and about how he had started to feel more at home in a role he never expected to take on. He spoke with passion, but there was still that lingering sense of uncertainty in his voice, the same sense that had plagued him from the start. "Sometimes, it feels like I'm doing the right thing, but then, other times, I wonder if I'm just stalling. Like, I've found something that feels good, but I'm still searching for something else, something more meaningful," Marcus confessed, his gaze falling to his hands as he fiddled with his coffee cup. Emma listened intently, nodding as he spoke. "Marcus, it's okay not to have it all figured out. Life isn't always about having a clear path. Sometimes, we just need to embrace the journey and trust that we're going in the right direction, even if it doesn't look like what we expected. You've already made such a huge impact on those kids. I can see how much they've grown because of you. But you're still figuring out what you need, and that's okay. Growth isn't always linear." Her words, calm and reassuring, filled Marcus with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps his restlessness wasn't a sign that he was on the wrong path, but rather a sign that he was simply in the process of becoming someone new, someone who was still learning and evolving. "So, do you think you figured it out?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or are you still figuring out your own path?" Emma smiled softly. "I think I'm in the same boat as you, just in a different way. I still don't have all the answers, but I'm learning to be okay with that. We all are, right?" Marcus smiled back, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. It was strange, but in talking to Emma, he realized that perhaps he had been putting too much pressure on himself to figure everything out all at once. Maybe it wasn't about finding the perfect answer, maybe it was about trusting the process, embracing the uncertainty, and letting his experiences shape him over time. After their conversation, Marcus walked away feeling more at peace than when he arrived. There were still questions, of course, questions about his future, about whether this tutoring job was the right path for him long-term, and whether he could reconcile his dreams of personal achievement with his desire to make a difference. But for the first time, he felt that he didn't need to have it all figured out right now. That night, Marcus sat at his desk and reflected on everything Emma had said. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Perhaps he didn't have to choose between the two halves of himself, the driven, ambitious side, and the more grounded, service-oriented side. Maybe they could coexist. Maybe he could find a way to achieve his dreams while still helping others. Marcus smiled to himself as he closed his journal. He didn't know what the future held, but he was finally beginning to accept that it didn't need to be perfect. For now, he could continue his work with the kids, continue his own growth, and trust that the answers would come in their own time. The next few weeks brought both progress and challenges. Marcus had found a rhythm with his tutoring, and the kids he worked with were showing clear signs of improvement. Malik, in particular, was doing well. He had begun reading more confidently, and his grades in math were improving steadily. There was no denying the satisfaction Marcus felt when he saw the positive changes in his students. But despite this success, a part of him still struggled with the question that had been eating at him for months: what was next? One Friday afternoon, as Marcus was wrapping up a tutoring session with Malik, he received an unexpected phone call. It was from Carla, the program coordinator. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about something," Carla said, her voice serious. "There's a new opportunity that has come up, and I think you'd be perfect for it. But I need to know if you're ready." Marcus was immediately intrigued. "What's the opportunity?" "There's an opening for a full-time position with the program," Carla explained. "It's a more senior role, one that involves overseeing other tutors, helping to structure the curriculum, and taking on more leadership responsibilities. It would mean a higher salary, more influence, and the chance to make an even bigger impact on the community." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The idea of a full-time position at the community center was exciting, and it felt like the next logical step. But as the words sunk in, a wave of uncertainty hit him. He had been so focused on the tutoring role, so comfortable with the connection he had built with the kids. Now, he was being asked to take on something much larger, something that would require him to step into a leadership role, make bigger decisions, and take on more responsibility than he had ever anticipated. Carla could sense his hesitation. "I know this is a big decision," she continued. "But you've been doing a great job, and I really think you're ready for this. I believe you can make a real difference in this role. You've got the passion, and you've got the experience. You just have to decide if it's the right time for you." Marcus sat quietly for a moment, processing Carla's words. He had always prided himself on his ability to rise to challenges, but this felt different. It wasn't just a matter of stepping up to a bigger role, it was a question of whether he was truly ready to take on this kind of responsibility. Could he balance the needs of the program, the demands of the community, and his own desire for personal fulfillment? "You don't have to make the decision right away," Carla said, sensing his internal struggle. "Take your time, and let me know what you think. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to consider it." Marcus thanked her and ended the call. He sat there for a while, staring out of his window at the quiet street outside. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. On one hand, it was the kind of opportunity that could help him make a significant difference on a larger scale. It would be the next step in his journey, the chance to push past his comfort zone. But on the other hand, it felt like a leap into the unknown, a step away from the familiar, the kids he had grown so close to, and the work that had become such a crucial part of his life. Later that evening, Marcus called Sarah to talk things through. She had always been the one he turned to for advice, the one who helped him see things clearly when he was feeling uncertain. "Sarah, I've got a big decision to make," Marcus said, getting straight to the point. "I've been offered a full-time role with the tutoring program. It's a leadership position, and I think it could be an amazing opportunity. But I don't know if I'm ready for it. It feels like a huge jump from where I am now." Sarah listened carefully, her voice calm and reassuring. "I can see why it feels like a big step," she said. "But think about what you've accomplished so far. You've already been making an impact, and now you have the chance to take that impact even further. It's okay to feel uncertain, it means you care about doing the right thing. But sometimes, we have to trust ourselves and take that leap, even if we're not entirely sure where it will lead." Marcus let her words sink in. He had been holding back because he was afraid of failing, afraid of taking on more than he could handle. But what if this was the moment he had been waiting for? The moment that would push him towards something greater, even if it felt uncomfortable at first. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice gaining confidence. "I can't let fear hold me back. I've been given a chance to make a real difference, and I think I'm ready for it." "Exactly," Sarah said with a smile in her voice. "You'll never know unless you try. And even if it's hard, you'll figure it out. You always do. The next day, Marcus met with Carla and accepted the full-time position. It wasn't an easy decision, and he still had doubts, but something in him knew it was the right choice. He was ready to take on this new challenge, to push past his comfort zone, and to prove to himself that he was capable of more than he thought. As he walked away from the meeting, Marcus felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The path ahead was unclear, and there would undoubtedly be obstacles. But for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he was standing on the edge of something bigger than himself. He was ready to leap into the unknown. As the days passed after Marcus's decision to take on the full-time leadership role at the community center, the reality of his choice began to sink in. It wasn't just about being promoted, it was about everything that came with the position, overseeing the other tutors, restructuring the curriculum, and building relationships with parents and community leaders. The stakes had never been higher. The first week in his new role felt like a whirlwind. Marcus found himself pulled in many directions at once. His days were packed with meetings, lesson planning, and helping other tutors manage their students. He quickly realized that being a leader wasn't as simple as just helping others, it was about guiding them, supporting them through challenges, and constantly adapting to their needs. Carla had warned him that the job would be demanding, but the pressure still caught him off guard. There were days when Marcus felt like he was failing to meet the expectations he had set for himself. He would sit at his desk late into the evening, eyes bleary, going over lesson plans that never seemed good enough or meeting after meeting where he struggled to make the right decisions. On top of his work responsibilities, Marcus felt the weight of his relationship with the students. He had always prided himself on his personal connection with them, especially Malik, whose progress had been one of the highlights of his tutoring journey. But now, as his role shifted, Marcus couldn't dedicate as much time to the kids he had grown so close to. He had to step back and let other tutors take over more of the hands-on work, and that was harder than he had anticipated. One day, as he was working through a new curriculum strategy, Malik knocked on his office door. His presence felt like a breath of fresh air. "Hey, Mr. Marcus," Malik said, stepping into the room with a small smile. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Marcus looked up from his papers, his heart lifting a little at the sight of Malik. He had missed these moments of one-on-one time, and it felt like a reminder of why he took this job in the first place. "Of course, Malik. What's on your mind?" Malik hesitated before sitting down. I don't know. I've been doing better in school, right? I've been trying really hard. But lately, it feels like I'm losing you a little. You've been so busy, and I haven't seen you as much." Marcus's heart sank. He had been so caught up in the demands of the leadership role that he hadn't realized the impact it was having on his relationship with the students. Malik's words cut through the fog of his stress, reminding him of why he had started this journey, to be there for these kids. "I'm sorry, Malik," Marcus said, his voice soft. "You're right. I've been distracted. But that doesn't mean I don't care about you. I'm still here for you, okay? I'm just trying to make sure I can help more people, even if I can't always be around like I used to be." Malik nodded slowly, but there was a trace of doubt in his eyes. "I get it. But I miss you being around. I feel like you're always busy with something else." Marcus knew Malik wasn't entirely wrong. He had been spread too thin, and in doing so, he had unintentionally distanced himself from the very kids he was supposed to be helping. The realization hit him hard. He had chosen this role to make a greater impact, but in doing so, he risked losing the connection that had been the heart of his work in the first place. That night, as he sat at his desk reflecting on his conversation with Malik, Marcus felt conflicted. He was determined to make this leadership role work, but he couldn't ignore the fact that his approach was coming at the expense of the personal relationships he had built with the kids. He needed to find a balance, a way to be both a leader and a mentor, without losing the core of what made his work meaningful. The next day, Marcus made a decision. He reached out to Carla and suggested a new structure for the program, one where he could still oversee the tutors and the curriculum, but with designated time carved out each week for him to work directly with the students. He knew it would be challenging, but he had to try. If he didn't, he risked losing the very thing that made him passionate about the work in the first place. To his relief, Carlo was supportive of the idea. "I think it's a great plan, Marcus. You've always been able to connect with the kids in a way that not many can. I think we can make this work." With Carlo's support, Marcus implemented the changes. He worked with the tutors to develop a more collaborative environment, where each tutor had the opportunity to step up and take charge of different areas of the program. At the same time, he carved out specific hours each week to spend directly with the students, giving them the personal attention they needed. The transition wasn't easy, and it took time for everyone to adjust. There were still moments when Marcus felt overwhelmed, when the pressure of the job threatened to undo everything he had worked for. But slowly, things began to settle. The tutors became more self-sufficient, and Marcus's connection with the kids deepened once again. Malik, in particular, flourished with the extra attention, his grades continuing to rise, and his confidence blossoming as he realized that Marcus had never stopped believing in him. One afternoon, as Marcus was helping Malik with a particularly tricky math problem, the boy looked up at him with a smile. "You were right, Mr. Marcus," Malik said, grinning. "I can do it. I just needed a little time." Marcus smiled back, feeling a surge of pride. He had done it. He had found the balance between his leadership role and his personal connection with the students. He had proven to himself that it was possible to make a greater impact without losing sight of the core values that had brought him to this point. As he watched Malik solve the last problem of the day, Marcus felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't experienced before. The work wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Every challenge, every struggle had led him here, to a place where he was making a difference, both in the lives of his students and in his own. The weeks following the restructuring were nothing short of transformative. Marcus had found his stride in the leadership role, but more importantly, he had regained the sense of purpose he had feared losing. The balance between overseeing the program and spending quality time with the students had made all the difference. He was no longer just a figurehead managing a team, he was still a mentor, a guide, and a teacher. The program flourished under the new structure. With more autonomy, the tutors had become more confident in their roles, and the students benefited from a more streamlined and personalized approach. The once overwhelming load on Marcus's shoulders lightened, and he was able to focus on the areas that mattered most, building relationships and continuing to help his students achieve their full potential. As for Malik, he had grown in ways Marcus hadn't even anticipated. The shy, withdrawn boy who had first walked into the community center was now a confident young man who had blossomed academically and personally. Marcus saw him not just as a student but as a reflection of the journey he had been on, a journey of self-doubt, growth, and resilience. One afternoon, after a particularly successful math session with Malik, the boy handed Marcus a small envelope. "Hey, Mr. Marcus," Malik said, his voice a little nervous. "I wanted to give you something. It's for you." Marcus looked at him, surprised. "What is it?" "Just open it." "I think you'll understand," Malik said, giving him a shy smile. Marcus opened the envelope, finding a handwritten note inside, along with a small certificate. The note read, "Mr. Marcus. Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. You made me realize that I'm capable of so much more. I'm going to keep working hard, not just for me, but for you too. You're more than just a tutor, you're a role model. I'll never forget that." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat as he read the note. It was the kind of heartfelt message that reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't the high-paying job, the recognition, or the status, it was the impact he could make in the lives of the people who needed him the most. Malik had included a certificate that read, "Most Improved Student of the Year, Malik Green." It wasn't the academic excellence that made the award meaningful, it was the change he had seen in Malik. This was what made the work worth it, the ability to be there for someone, to help them grow beyond what they thought was possible. Malik, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, this is incredible. I don't know what to say. You've worked so hard, and I'm so proud of you. This means more to me than you know. The two shared a moment of silence, both feeling the weight of the journey they had been on together. For Marcus, it wasn't just about what he had taught Malik, it was about what Malik had taught him. Over the next few months, Marcus's confidence in his role continued to grow. He became more comfortable in his leadership position, and the program began to gain more attention within the community. Local schools started to refer their students to the tutoring program, and even some local businesses began offering donations to help fund its expansion. The work was challenging, but it was fulfilling in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. And then, one evening, as Marcus was sitting at his desk going over the next semester's curriculum, his phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. They had kept in touch over the past few months, but their conversations had been more about life in general than anything specific. Marcus, I know we don't talk as often as we used to, but I've been thinking about you a lot. How's everything going with the program? I hope you're still taking care of yourself and not working too hard. Marcus smiled as he read the message. He had always appreciated Sarah's ability to ground him, to remind him that life was about more than just the work you did. But as he sat back in his chair, reflecting on everything that had transpired since he made the decision to take on the leadership role, he realized something profound. He had found a new sense of balance, a new sense of purpose, not just in his work, but in his life as a whole. He typed a response, feeling a sense of peace. Hey Sarah, everything's going great. The program has been thriving, and I'm finally in a place where I feel like I'm making a difference. I can honestly say I'm happy with where I am right now. It hasn't always been easy, but I've learned so much about myself along the way. I think I've found what I was looking for. As he hit send, Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. He had made it through the struggle, had faced the doubts and uncertainties, and had come out on the other side stronger. He had not only found success in his work but had also rediscovered his passion for teaching and mentoring. The journey wasn't over. There would always be more challenges, more lessons to learn. But for the first time, Marcus felt certain that he was on the right path. He was no longer searching for answers. He had found them within himself. A few days later, Carla called him into her office. As he sat down across from her, she smiled warmly. You've done amazing work, Marcus, Carla said. The program is growing, and the kids are thriving. I think it's time we start looking at how we can expand even further. You've earned it. Marcus felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. He had come so far from the uncertain young man who had first walked into the program months ago. And now, he was ready for whatever the future held. Thank you, Carla, he said with a genuine smile. I'm ready for the next step. As he left Carla's office, Marcus looked out the window and saw the bustling street below. The world was full of possibilities, and for the first time in his life, Marcus felt ready to embrace them all. The future was bright, and it was his to shape. And so, with a sense of purpose and clarity, Marcus stepped into the next chapter of his life, a chapter where the journey was never truly over, but always unfolding, one step at a time. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?